The Arizona dawn crawled over the mesas like a slow-moving fire, painting the desert in molten gold as if the sun were forging the world anew. But the light that touched Elias Crow's homestead felt colder than it had in years. For today was the day he would lose everything he had built with the calluses on his hands and the years carved off his life. The lean wooden cabin that leaned slightly to the east where monsoon had pushed against it 5 summers ago. The stone-lined well he had dug by hand with nothing but a rusted shovel and a promise to his wife that they'd never go thirsty on this harsh land. The fenced corral that had once held 3 horses before times grew tight, and he had sold 2, the final one now grazing quietly as if unaware that its world too was about to be taken by men who wielded ledgers like weapons and deeds like shackles. Elias stood on his porch with a stillness that felt carved from stone, staring across the fields where a convoy of black-coated surveyors marched like carrion birds, hammering stakes into earth that had been his for over a decade. He watched them with a jaw clenched hard enough to ache, and though he tried not to show it, a hollow pain echoed in his chest because this dirt, this stubborn, red, unforgiving dirt, was where he had buried his wife, where he had held his newborn son, where he had bled, worked, starved, prayed, and risen again. He had known the eviction was coming, ever since the Silver Dominion Railroad began laying tracks like iron scars across the valley, their private locomotive hissing and growling half a mile away like a steel predator waiting for its prey to stop struggling. He remembered the sheriff, hat low, voice guilty, handing him a notice, stamped with authority purchased through political bribes and bribe signatures, and Elias had simply nodded, too tired to fight a machine bigger than any man. "You can appeal this, Elias," the sheriff had murmured quietly, but Elias had shaken his head, replying, "They've already decided," because he had seen the hunger in the Hardinger brothers' eyes months before, the hunger of men who mistook ambition for destiny, who saw farmers not as people but as obstacles, who believed that the future belonged not to families or roots but to steal and profit. Still, as Elias packed his belongings that morning, he worked slowly, not because he was delaying the inevitable but because he knew that once he left this porch, a chapter of his life would close forever. The wind carried the smell of sage and dust, the familiar scent of survival, and for a moment he closed his eyes, remembering how his wife, Mara, used to stand barefoot on this porch at dawn, humming softly as the sun rose. He remembered the day she died from fever, and how the land had felt unbearably quiet afterward, yet he had stayed, because somehow being here made her feel less gone. He was thinking of her when a shift in the wind interrupted his thoughts, a strange stillness falling across the valley like a held breath, and Elias opened his eyes to see a thin plume of dust rising far off in the distance, too straight, too fast, too purposeful to be the work of the wind. He squinted, shielding his eyes, and then he saw them, riders. 7, maybe 8. They came over the ridge with the certainty of a coming storm, their silhouettes sharp against the morning light, horses moving with a disciplined grace that made the surveyors falter mid-stride. Elias felt his pulse quicken. He recognized that formation. Apache warriors. Not a raiding party. They moved too deliberately for that. This was something else, something heavier, something that felt like the land itself had summoned them. At their front rode Atza Redknife, a name whispered across the territory not with fear but with respect. Elias had only met him 3 times in the last 10 years, always briefly, always quietly, because their relationship was a matter of mutual respect rather than formal alliance. When Elias first settled on this land, he had asked permission to draw water from the spring that the Apache considered sacred, and he had vowed never to take what was not offered. He had kept that vow, even in hard years, and Atza had not forgotten. As the riders approached, the surveyors' confidence collapsed, fear flickering across their faces like lantern light in a storm. The Apache halted in a perfect line, dust swirling around their horses' hooves like rising spirits, and Atza dismounted with a steady, unhurried grace before approaching the porch where Elias stood. His eyes were dark, ancient, carrying the weight of history far older than any railroad charter. "The steel men come," Atsa said in a voice like distant thunder. They take what is not theirs. Elias exhaled, the bitterness rising in him sharper than cactus spines. They have papers, he replied quietly, signed by men in far-off offices who don't know this land or anything on it. Atsa's gaze hardened as he looked over the violated earth, the stakes driven in like miniature spears. Paper is weak, he said. It cannot grow life. It cannot protect a home. It cannot remember the people who walked it. His hand touched the ground lightly, respectfully. But the land remembers you. Elias Crow. Elias swallowed, emotion tightening his throat. He opened his mouth to speak, but the sudden shout from the surveyors cut through the air. You've got no right to be here. One of them barked, voice trembling behind false bravado. This is company property now. Atsa did not turn his body, only his head, the slow motion, carrying more weight than any sudden movement could. Company did not ask the land, he said simply. The surveyors retreated a step, uncertainty crawling up their spines. Elias watched, feeling something unfamiliar stir inside him. Hope, maybe, or the ghost of defiance long buried under the exhaustion of fighting systems too big to comprehend. When Atsa looked at him again, he spoke words Elias would replay in his mind for the rest of his life. You were driven from your home. So this land calls for warriors. Today, we stand with you. Elias stared at him, struggling to process what he had just heard. Stand with me? Against the railroad? Atsa nodded once, a movement sharp as a blade. Against those who believe the land is something to own like livestock. This place is alive. You respected it. Now it respects you. The morning wind rose suddenly, swirling around the homestead as if awakened, and Elias felt the truth of Atsa's words settle into his bones. The Apache warriors repositioned around the property, not aggressive, but protective, forming a silent circle of watchful strength. And in that moment Elias realized something that made his breath itch. He was no longer alone. Not in spirit, not in presence, not in purpose. The railroad had taken his land on paper, but they had unintentionally done something far more dangerous. They had given him allies. They had given him witnesses. They had given him warriors. For the first time in years, Elias Crow felt the faint burn of fire in his chest, a spark reigniting. The Hardinger brothers thought they could evict a farmer, but today the land itself responded, with riders of the desert, men who understood honor, men who understood boundaries deeper than any deed. As Elias stood beside Atsa Redknife, the sun rising higher behind them like a lit torch, he understood one thing with absolute clarity. The railroad had made a mistake, a grave one, and the price for it had only begun to reveal itself.